All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I'm the head of marketing for the Expert Institute. Today's webinar will focus on the best practices for using open FDA data in medical device cases. Our presenter today is Christina Bernstein. She specializes in engineering and regulatory affairs for medical device commercialization. Ms. Bernstein currently owns and operates her own medical device company in California. After the presentation, we'll set aside some time for a Q&A. You can type your questions into the question box on your control panel, and Mrs. Bernstein will answer you verbally. Please save your questions for the end of the presentation. Thanks again for attending, and please welcome Christina Bernstein.
Hello. And Mike, could you go to the next slide, please? Great. Hi, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to call in. I wanted to let you know this set of slides that I have, I'm not going to try to overwhelm you with technical detail because sometimes it can take a little bit of practice to easily get this information. And I'm also willing to help any of you if you have questions afterward. You can send me an email, and as you'll see, a lot of this information is really easy to look up. It's free. It's public data. So don't worry too much about the nuts and bolts of doing it. You can always refer back to the slides. You can always ask me questions later. And just to give you a little bit of background, I have been working as an expert witness for about 2 years now. And I started working as an expert witness because my husband's an attorney, not for medical devices, but other things. And I've had some attorneys tell me, well, you should do expert witness work because there's not a lot of people around that can explain the ins and outs of what the FDA regulations mean for medical devices and how they're marketed in the US. And also, another thing that I found in the last couple of years is that an attorney will bring me a case that they're working on, and they could be for the plaintiff or they could be defending a medical device manufacturer, but what they do is they'll bring me their argument, because that's what you guys do. That's what attorneys do. You prepare your argument, and you're going to go to a mediation or you're going to go to a trial and argue your client's case. And although I find it very compelling, I also have to independently verify some of the information that they're presenting to me, because that's part of my job as an expert, is to say, well, is this really the case? And not because it's someone's opinion, but just what are the actual data that support the argument whether a device may be at fault in injuring a patient. And that's also part of my typical thought process. Is I'm a certified quality auditor from the American Society of Quality, and we always need to independently verify the data. So Mike, if you could go to the next slide, please. So what we're going to do in this relatively short time today is I'm going to show you some examples of different types of medical devices that are sold in the US and how you can obtain public information. And when I mean public, it tends to all be on the FDA's website, because the Food and Drug Administration is the regulator for medical devices that are marketed in the US. Whether they're made by American companies or foreign companies, any manufacturer that wants to sell their product in the United States has to go through the FDA process. And I'll talk a little bit about that in further slides. So we're going to go through some examples of devices that have been involved in quite a few court cases. I actually asked the Expert Institute to give me information on some devices that they see as coming up a lot of inquiries for expert information. And then we're going to also talk about, toward the end, if you do look at the public data and you see that there is a pattern and you think there might be some problems with the device, there's also ways that you can look up what the FDA has found out about manufacturing locations and communicate with manufacturers. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so if you look at the young lady there in the picture, that's the patient. She's undergoing a procedure. It looks like they're taking a look at her abdomen. She could be getting an ultrasound for, maybe she's going to have a baby. Maybe she's got, she doesn't look like she's in too much pain or anything. But one of the reasons I like to talk about, who is affected, there's a whole series of events here, and there's a whole chain of people, and all of them are affecting how this medical diagnostic is being used. So there's the patient who is undergoing a diagnostic procedure, and then you also see a person there in the background who looks like a technician or a nurse. And then there's also another person who's operating this ultrasound probe. There's the healthcare facility where the procedure is taking place. Then there's the manufacturer of the device, this ultrasound system. And then another party is the regulators, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. So all of these parties can affect patient outcomes. And it's really important to keep that in mind, because a device can be improperly used even if it was designed properly. And we'll talk about some of that later. But part of the FDA clearance or approval process for devices is that the manufacturer has to have a whole quality system behind it. And the quality system takes into account how the product is actually used in addition to how it's marketed. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, and again, as I mentioned, I had asked the Expert Institute to tell me about some products, medical devices, where they see a lot of requests for expertise. And there are a lot of court cases that involve vaginal mesh, which is an implant for women. If you're not familiar with why you would use a vaginal mesh, often a woman that's had children or older women as they age and lose some muscle tone, it's possible for some of their internal organs to prolapse or to actually start to protrude from the vaginal opening. And it's embarrassing for ladies, and it also can be very painful. And another point that I wish to make here is that there is one manufacturer. I happen to clip this from a legal newsletter. There's a company called CR Bard. They make vaginal mesh. There are multiple manufacturers of surgical mesh products. So we actually have a slide coming up that will talk about another manufacturer of the same type of product. But what's important, if you're first just trying to get information, is not only does CR Bard as a manufacturer make a surgical mesh, it turns out that I asked Expert Institute to give me the brand names of some surgical mesh, pelvic, transvaginal mesh. It's all kind of a similar product. It turns out that just this one manufacturer, they have around 20 brand names. And some of them are older versions of the same thing. Some of them are, maybe shaped or cut a little bit differently. So it's not enough if you're just looking at CR Bard. No, you really need to see what is the exact product that you're interested in finding out information on. Could you go to the next slide, please? So what I did was, there's a newer tool. We're going to go in a couple more slides. I'm going to show you some other information that's available on the FDA's website. But FDA also has a new initiative called Open FDA. And if you're familiar with doing some programming, it's a way that can very, very quickly bring up information about adverse events that are stored in the FDA's systems. So when I got the name of some of these products that are made by CR Bard, one of the brand names is called Pelvilase. And really within about 10 seconds, I was able to run an inquiry on the internet, and it came back and it said that there were 656 injuries, 13 malfunctions, and 2 other problems. And these are all attributed to that one product. They have adverse event reports in the FDA's database. And because this is very quick to do, it's a good way to just get an idea of how many problems there potentially could be. Could you go to the next slide, please? Again, do not worry if you're not someone who's familiar with programming languages. I only put this slide in here just to show you an example. But the text that's in blue, if you look at it, it looks a little bit like an internet address. And so it turns out that OpenFDA is a kind of a Java inquiry, and Java is a type of programming language that many websites use, and many, you know, if you're on a website and it's giving you information on, you know, how many things happened or how many people like a page or something, often it's this Java language that's behind it. So what happens is if you actually were to copy this text that's in blue and go into your browser window, what you're doing is you're asking the FDA's OpenFDA endpoint to come back and give you information. And you can substitute the brand name Pelvalase. You can substitute it with any other brand name of any other device that's out there. And it would come back and it would give you, you know, very, very quickly, I mean 10 seconds or so. And again, if you're not a programmer, believe me, I'm still getting the hang of this too. It's something that is very easy to do. So you can always ask me a question, or you can try it yourself. Can you go to the next page, please? Okay, so as I had mentioned, there are many companies that make transvaginal mesh products. Another one is Ethicon. I just happened to see this on the Expert Institute's blog, but just really within the last couple of weeks, Ethicon, which is part of Johnson & Johnson, they were, I guess they found against the company, and they're considerable cases, so I can see why there would be a lot of interest in finding out experts on these products. And again, even if you have someone who is a clinical expert, like a surgeon or a nurse, even an engineer that's worked on these products, very often they're definitely experts in the engineering and the clinical use of products, but not everybody is so familiar with this sort of backstory of what the FDA information is that's available. So if you know a little bit about what's out there and how you can search for it, it can often help you decide if you need to look at further information, or if if you're convinced that there really was a problem with the device, it can help bolster your arguments too. Or if there is no problem with the device and you're defending a manufacturer, you can definitely use that to argue your case as well. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, at this point, almost anybody I've ever talked to about all this data that's out there, people always ask me, well, it's a medical device sold in the US, and what about clinical trials? So here's the thing. Unlike drugs, and unlike very high-risk devices, most medical devices that are sold in the US do not have to go through a clinical trial, which means that if you're looking for information on the FDA's website, public information, you are most likely not going to find any formal clinical trial data on human beings. And that's because the FDA classifies medical devices into low, medium, and high risk. And anything that's low or medium risk, which is the vast majority of devices, all of the ones that we're talking about in today's webinar, they're all considered moderate risk. They're just not going to have clinical trial data for the most part. And the reason that's important to know is, well, when you look at some of the complaints, the things that are in the FDA's database, there are manufacturer narratives and there are also end user narratives. Like, someone who was at the hospital or the clinic and perceived that they had a problem with the device, they will write their narrative. The manufacturer will sometimes take a look at what the clinical site is claiming, and they will write their own narrative. And the reason it's important to know that is that you can have multiple incident reports for the same problem, one from the clinical viewpoint, one from the manufacturer's viewpoint. And we'll look at some of those adverse event reports in a couple more slides. The process by which a lot of these medical devices are cleared to market in the US is an application. It has a number of the 510K, and a 510K will typically have bench testing type of data. You know, that's the kind of thing where a manufacturer will have a device, maybe it's made out of some different kinds of plastics or metals, and they'll do corrosion testing and strength testing, and they'll make sure that the manufacturing process doesn't introduce any contamination. And there's also a possibility to do some biocompatibility testing, and a lot of that's in test tubes. It could be on animals, but again, you're not really going to get any, I wouldn't count on having any data from human trials. I will say the higher risk devices, and these are things that are like permanent implants that are life-sustaining, so your typical pacemaker, defibrillator, they are considered high-risk devices. They do have extensive clinical trial data, and they also have to do post-market reporting. But it's a little bit beyond what we're going to talk about today in the webinar. But just be aware that there is that additional data for devices like that. Could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so another thing I did while I was looking into some of these hip implants and vaginal mesh implants, I found an FDA report. You can look at it yourself if you're interested. It's this light blue text shows what you have to type in to get it on the internet. And it turns out that only 20 kinds of medical devices account for 80% of adverse event reports. And so you may say to yourself, well, how can that be? Well, most of the devices are things like cardiovascular implants and also orthopedic implants like hips and knees. It doesn't necessarily always mean the manufacturer is doing a bad job. Most people that have to have a pacemaker or a defibrillator implanted, these people are really ill. And, you know, unfortunately, they can have some side effects. It may not have anything to do with having a device implanted in them. They could just be in really poor health, and, you know, that's often what happens if there's a lawsuit. That, you know, that's the decision that has to be made, and the argument that has to be made is, was it actually the product, you know, or was the patient really just in such poor health that almost anything could have triggered a problem. So as I said, we're going to have a couple more slides later on where I'll show you some information that could help you decide. And can you please go to the next slide? So this text, this is a screenshot. It's a little bit difficult to read, but what I wanted to show you is if you go to the FDA's website, I went to hip implants just because when I was looking up the vaginal meshes, I had mentioned there's different manufacturers. They even have different brand names. Well, hip implants, it turns out, are even more diverse. And what I want to show you, it's a little difficult on this particular slide, but every medical device that is sold in the US has a product code, and the product code is something that's assigned by the FDA. And in this case, this particular kind of hip implant has a product code. It says LWJ there. It's important, it's very easy to find the product codes for devices. Basically, what I do, I've had attorneys call me up and talk to me about a case, and I almost always will just sit there and type in on a search engine, FDA product code, manufacturer name, brand name, and it almost always comes up instantly. But what's interesting is if you're on the FDA's website, all of the text that's in a lighter blue color, if you're really online, you can actually click on this. And so it turns out, as I had mentioned, I found out there's tons of different kinds of hip implants. This particular one was a metallic, uncemented, semi-constrained hip prosthesis. And I'm not an orthopedic expert. I'm just telling you this is how you can look up the FDA data on this product. So what the advantages or disadvantages of that particular hip implant are, that I don't know. But you can find out all this information. So if you click on things like the regulation number, it'll bring up any guidelines or standards that are associated with that particular product. And then, as I said, there's all these different manufacturers, and you can actually click online and find out what products they manufacture. And then there's also something, I'll give you an example of it later, called a total product lifecycle report, and that's the FDA's way of calling it the recall history. And that way you can find out. One thing I always look at is if a manufacturer has all of the recalls and problems and none of the other manufacturers that make the same kind of thing have it, well, they might not be reporting and doing what they should be doing, which is issuing recalls, but often it can indicate, just a problem with that particular manufacturer. If, on the other hand, you look and there's, in this case, gosh, I think we have more than 10 manufacturers. If they all have recalls on the products, then you could say, well, these types of products may just be problematic and maybe nobody's got the manufacturing or the quality control quite figured out yet. Can you go to the next slide, please? So as I had mentioned, a lot of the information, when you're actually online, you can click on all these manufacturer names. You can look at recalls. You can look at warning letters. We'll get to that later, too. And one thing that I did want to point out is I gave you an example a little bit earlier about using this query called OpenFDA. The reason that it's so interesting, even though it's a little bit awkward to do the Java code, FDA has this database that's called MAUDE, and it's been around for a really long time, and it contains all the adverse event reports. But MAUDE has a limitation because it's on some pretty old computer systems. It will only return 500 records at a time. And I used to think that was fine because I've worked on some cases where the products were problematic, say, or they were interested in finding out if the problem had occurred, but there weren't so many entries in the adverse event database. But when I had spoken to Expert Institute and they told me about, say, looking into vaginal mesh or hip implants, it turns out that there are way more than 500 records. And in fact, there's something like 500 records every 2 weeks. And the MAUDE database goes back to the year 2006. And so the traditional way to look through adverse event reports, if you were only getting 500 records at a time, you'd have to do, every 2 weeks, you'd have to go all the way back if you really wanted to see the true history of complaints. So the OpenFDA is very, very useful, as I said, to get a quick idea, especially for these types of devices where there's just lots and lots of data in the adverse event database. And so another way that you can use the OpenFDA query, I gave you an example where we had the manufacturer's brand name, but that product code that I had mentioned a little bit ago, you can also put in the product code. You're going to get a bazillion records back because, if there's more than 20 manufacturers, say, of that product code and they each have some adverse events, you're going to get a lot of data. But at least you can say, okay, this is what's going on. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so another device that has been in the news quite a bit, and I happen to know quite a bit about this company, is there's a manufacturer called Intuitive Surgical. and they make the Da Vinci robot. And almost all adverse event reports that are in the FDA system for robots, I would say the vast majority of them are Intuitive Surgical. And the reason is there used to be only 2 companies that made this type of medical device, and it was Intuitive Surgical, and it was another company called Computer Motion. But Computer Motion was acquired by Intuitive Surgical, and then they put them out of business. So they acquired their competitor and then, shut them down. So for a long, long time, Intuitive Surgical was really the only type of surgical robot out there. And there are some newer ones, but they've only been around for, like, say, a year or 2. They may have some adverse event reports, but in this case, it would be a little bit tough to say, well, I'm going to compare this manufacturer to all other manufacturers, because really they were the only one. But what's interesting is I looked into what some of the data is that's on the FDA's database, and I will show you again how we can go through it and find some of these recall notices and even a warning letter. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this is a screen snapshot of one adverse event report. And the way that I got to it was I knew the product code. The previous slide shows the product code for a surgical robot, which is NAY. And there's a lot of information that'll come up. It'll tell you, yes, it's class 2. And as I mentioned before, class 2 is considered moderate risk device, so you're not going to find a lot of clinical trial data. And another thing that happens is that when you look up that particular product code, there's what the FDA calls the recall history, which is total product life cycle report. I clicked on it, and then I just happened to click on a recent adverse event. So in this case, this is a manufacturer narrative. And what that means is somewhere else, if you look for these event dates, you will find the narrative from the clinical location, from the healthcare facility. But this is the manufacturer's interpretation of what they were told. And you can also see, if you look in the text of it, some of the information is redacted, and that's because the FDA will not actually publicly identify the healthcare facility or the names of the patient because of HIPAA. And in this case, though, as I said, you can look at the event date and you may be able to find the report from the healthcare facility, and sometimes you can kind of tell, because these devices are expensive, and typically even in major cities there's not that many facilities that own them, so they're limited. But again, this is the manufacturer's narrative. There was a handpiece. It's a disposable instrument or reusable instrument, and this particular one was supposed to seal a vessel, and it didn't really do that adequately, so the patient had some blood loss, like 1.5 liters of blood loss. And it says here at the end, the instrument was returned to the manufacturer and failed a gap gauge test, which is some sort of internal test that they have. So what's interesting is, if you were to look in OpenFDA, it will give you all of this same text. It'll just spit it back onto your computer screen. But this particular printout is when I use the traditional MAUDE inquiry. And again, I hope I'm not confusing anybody. It's something that if you do it 1 or 2 times, you start to get the hang of it. And again, if anybody does have any particular questions, I'm really happy to help you out afterward if you send me an email. It's really fast and really easy to do this. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so these were all the points that I made where The data is publicly available. It's free. It's very fast to look this stuff up once you get the hang of it. However, there is one really important point to make, and as attorneys, you know that just because there's a record of a problem, it does not establish that a medical device is the cause of the problem. It gives you an idea if there's a lot of facilities that are reporting problems where that device is implicated in some sort of adverse event for the patient. Again, the important part to remember is, especially for some of these high-risk devices, the patients, these people are really ill. And, it may just be that the stress of undergoing a procedure has caused problems. So how do you, as an attorney, have this wealth of public data? You may also have access to a manufacturer's internal data, especially if you're representing a manufacturer. So what's really important, and this is actually gets into how the FDA regulates medical devices in the US, is you want to compare this public data that you're finding, that you're looking at, and you want to see what is the manufacturer saying that the device can do. And also, you can look at a patient's record. That's always very important. You can get the hospital's records. And then the last thing is the FDA seeing problems with the manufacturer or its product? And again, I'm going to give you some examples. If you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so in addition to everything that we've talked about up until now has been these adverse event reports, looking at whether you go in through the traditional MOD interface or you use OpenFDA. We're just talking about, we're looking at adverse event reports. There are also other types of reports and letters available. Again, it's all through FDA. And what you would want to look at is the FDA regularly inspects manufacturing locations. Now, when a device is considered a low or moderate risk device, the FDA may not go out even for like a year or two, especially, if there's a newly cleared device. I personally work with a lot of smaller companies, startup companies, and technology transfer spin-offs from universities. And even after getting the first couple of products cleared and having, a quality system and good manufacturing practices, there's a couple of my clients where the FDA still has not gone out and done an inspection, because the FDA, the F in FDA stands for food, and these people are really, really busy, and they are always short-staffed. However, if you have something that's like a higher risk device, and again, we're talking about these cardiovascular implants, pacemakers, things like that, or some of these more novel things like the robots, the FDA actually will go and inspect the manufacturing location before they give the manufacturer clearance or approval to sell the device in the US. So you definitely have more data available, like I said, for these higher risk devices. And then even a lower risk device that's, stents, implants, things like that. Most of the companies have been around for a really long time. Companies like Zimmer, Stryker, Ethicon, they will have information at FDA's database if, their facilities have been inspected. And so what you want to look for is there's a thing that's called the Form 483, and the difference between data on a Form 483 and data that you would just find in a medical adverse event report that's in MOD is that Form 483 is something that is filled out by a trained FDA inspector. So these people typically are trained in auditing techniques. They may be subject matter experts for orthopedics or cardiovascular. They might have an engineering background. They could be almost anything. But most of the people that go out and do inspections for FDA, they're really well trained, and they know what they're looking for. So the Form 483 is what you would consider an expert's opinion of what the manufacturer has either complied with or if there are deficiencies. And what FDA does is if they have deficiencies noted on the 483, the FDA will typically give the manufacturer a period of time to correct it. Unless, there have been cases, usually these things are in the news too, is if FDA goes out and they find something that's life-threatening and serious, I mean, they will go in and shut the manufacturer down, if there's serious contamination or they feel as though the product would be an immediate, life-threatening device, then they will shut that down. But that is very, very rare. And most of the time, the FDA and the manufacturer will negotiate a little bit of time, and often deficiencies can also be very minor things. They could be a training record could not be properly located, or an employee was out on maternity leave and missed, a mandatory training date because they were away. And then typically for a situation like that, the manufacturer would say, okay, well, our employee's back now from her leave, and, she will be in the next training session. And they'll say, okay. A serious deficiency, though, again, is things like, manufacturing process will not produce consistent quality devices, breakages, or if there's contamination, things like that. And what you can do is you can go to this database. Again, it's something that is a pretty easy interface, and you can type in the name of the product, you can type in the name of the manufacturer, you can type in the state that the manufacturing location is in, and it will bring up any warning letters in Form 483s that have been listed on the FDA's website. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so this one, we're picking on poor Intuitive Surgical here, but it's an interesting product, and they did have this problem, and I actually was personally aware of this even in just the local newspaper was talking about this because they're a big company in Silicon Valley, and it's an interesting product. So even the local newspaper here was I'm in San Francisco, they were reporting on this. And I know some people from school that work there as engineers. And anyway, what happened was the FDA actually issued a warning letter to Intuitive Surgical because if you go back and look at the online data that's available, you'll see that they have this Form 483, and they were supposed to correct some problems, but the FDA did not feel that they corrected the problems. So one thing that's very important to note, and this is a legal point here, is according to, and they're actually in the warning letter telling the manufacturer which section of the Federal Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act it is. The problem that Intuitive Surgical is having now is that because this whole quality system, and this is like a whole other subject I'm not going to go into, but there's this quality system that all devices have behind them. If there's a problem with how the product is being marketed, and the FDA feels that the manufacturer is not properly marketing the device or is mislabeling or misbranding the device, it's actually considered an adulterated device. And so it's illegal to market that. And so this is actually a pretty severe problem for the manufacturer. And manufacturers really hate these warning letters. This particular company is publicly traded, and it can affect the stock price. It can affect distribution deals if they have them. It can affect further investment in the company. It's just one of those things that manufacturers really don't want to have a warning letter, but they exist. And just as a personal aside, Intuitive is a pretty good-sized company, and they're pretty innovative. Their product was something that was really the only one of its kind for a long time. And I know some of the engineers there, the people I went to school with, and believe me, they are not doing it on purpose. They just probably have some devices that maybe they're not consistently performing, which of course they have to correct. But Intuitive's a fairly good-sized company. I actually had a situation a few years ago where we wanted to use a manufacturing location that was in Southern California. It was a family-owned business, and they always did a real good job for us. They were a fairly low technology kind of a contract manufacturer. They would make liquids and gels and things like that, and they could bottle it for you. And I work with some companies in Europe that make surgical instrument cleaners and ultrasound gels and things like that. So it's the kind of stuff that, you make thousands and thousands of them at a time, and, you want to have a nice clean facility. So what happened was we had a manufacturing facility all picked out. They had done some test, production for us in real limited amounts, and they were good people. And they had a change in ownership, and because the person that had founded the company was elderly and had retired. They had this change in ownership, and the FDA went out and did an inspection and found out that a lot of chemicals were not being disposed of properly, and they were being improperly stored in another area of the building. And they found contamination, not thank goodness in our product, but they had some, I believe they were making some powdered baby formula, and they found some problems with contamination in the packaging, I think, that they were using for the baby formula. So the FDA issued a warning letter, and we actually could not have that facility produce our product because they were not allowed to produce any kind of a new device. And ours was something that was newly cleared. It was considered an accessory to a device. So I had to go through, it was really stressful. And we actually found another location that could do our manufacturing, and we still use them to this day. They're good people. But it's just one of those things where there are always probably more than two sides to every story. And so, although it's easy to pick out all these examples, it's very easy to find a lot of this data. But as I had said before, you really do also need to look at it in detail. And it's something that it's very interesting. Everybody's got a different type of situation, and even if you have a situation where someone's using a medical device and maybe that medical device has had litigation against it in the past, you still need to really be able to look at this stuff because it may or may not have affected the patient. And can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I really thank everybody for their attention. I know that some of this material can be a little bit dry, and if you haven't done it before, it does seem like it's kind of strange. But again, if anybody does have a specific kind of a request, it's very easy for me to do this, and you can always email me the name of the product or the name of the manufacturer, and I can give you some tips on how to quickly look up the information.
All right, great, Christina. Thanks so much for the presentation. We're going to open it up now for Q&A, so if anybody has any questions, please enter it into the question box. Okay, so our first question, can you please explain what other medical devices, to your knowledge, have a high volume of adverse event data on the open FDA system?
Oh, I think the easiest way to do that is if we went back to, can we go back to that slide that has the information that says only 20 product codes cause 80% of the problems? It's the slide that was maybe one of the middle slides. That one. If you can, okay, off the top of my head, I mean, I do know some products now because I had talked to the Expert Institute about these vaginal mesh and hip implants, knee implants. If you actually were to go and look at this report, there's a couple of tables in the middle of it. It's not a super long report, and it's not too difficult to read, but if you just are really limited on time, just click on that web location, go to like the middle, and there's a couple of tables, and they actually have a list of these product codes. And you'll see it's mostly cardiovascular devices and orthopedic implants.
Okay, great. Next question. This is from Janet McGrew. There is MOD for medical devices. What is there for pharmaceutical drugs?
Ah, okay. Let me tell you, I will tell you, I am not a drug expert. I really am an engineer. I come from an engineering background, and I've worked on medical devices. But it is not called MOD, and I'm not 100% sure what it's called, but if you like, after this webinar, I will send you an email with the locator for it. And it's pretty extensive because, as I had mentioned, drugs do have to go through these clinical trials. So you have a lot more data on drugs than most devices.
Okay, next question from Donald Shute. Are dental devices, endodontic files, drills, subject to the adverse event reporting?
Yes, because it doesn't make any difference. It's a medical device, so whether it's used for dental or oral surgery or surgery somewhere else in the body, they're all under the same regulations.
Okay, great. Next question. In addition to the number of injuries, what other metrics are available on OpenFDA?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of them. So I have actually just started looking into this because I actually didn't know very much about OpenFDA before. And when I talked to some of the folks, like actually Mike, who's emceeing this presentation, I just started looking into the OpenFDA stuff. And the other thing is OpenFDA has only been available since late in 2014, and they continue to revise it. But there is a very extensive list of what you would call a parameter that you can search on. So it does all pull from these adverse event reports, but you can look at specific manufacturing locations. You can look at specific device codes. You can look at specific locations. You can even look at, I believe there's some foreign location data because so much medical device manufacturing is overseas. So it's pretty extensive, and I can also send you an email that has the OpenFDA. They have a website, and you can click and you can look. There's a lot of different data fields that they list.
Okay. We have one comment from James Watts. He says the drug report is called MedWatch.
Oh, thank you. I didn't know it was called MedWatch because that's what the adverse event forms are too for devices. Okay.
All right. Thanks a
Okay,
lot,
so I
James.
guess there's probably, yeah, thank you, James. I guess MedWatch covers drugs too. I'm going to look into that. And then I think it was Janet that asked that question, and I promised to get back to her too.
Okay. Does anybody else have any more questions? All right. I think that's it for today. Thank you very much, Christina. That was an excellent presentation. If anyone is interested in retaining Ms. Bernstein as an expert witness, please contact the Expert Institute and we will facilitate the engagement. Thanks again, everyone, and stay tuned for more webinars in the future.